that they're not.
Welcome, everybody. Make sure you're all on mute. Good. Perfect. Let's see. Dan, your co-host. Aaron, your co-host. Good. So when we get to you guys, perfect. Welcome, everybody. Appreciate you being here. This session is New York State Malting Barley Varieties. And this is going to be a great conversation. There's a lot of exciting stuff to talk about. But first, I want to thank our Tuesday presenting sponsor, which is Belmark. Thank you for sponsoring today's sessions. And the session sponsors are the Hillebrand Beer Supply Chain and Keg Management Specialist, Tri-State Carbonation. We appreciate their support as well as we head into the second week of our conference, our virtual conference. So before we get into the topic at hand, I just want to make some introductions. I want to introduce Mark Sorrells, who is the Cornell Professor, School of Integrated Plant Science and Plant Breeding and Genetics. The Cornell Small Grains Project, which they all work on, has a history of over 100 years of developing innovative approaches to crop improvement. The research program utilizes appropriate technologies encompassing molecular genetics, physiology, pathology, and breeding to research strategies that contribute to the development of superior crop varieties for both conventional and organic cropping systems. There's a lot to talk about there. I'm by no means a specialist at this sort of thing, but when I go to the Malt Barley Summit every year, I learn a little bit more. So thank you, Mark, for being here. Joining him is Dan Sweeney, who's a Cornell graduate student, the School of Integrative Plant Science, Plant Breeding, and Genetics as well. And he worked directly with Mark on the new barley variety that we're going to discuss shortly. So thank you, Dan, for being a part of this. And then, of course, lastly, but not least, Aaron McLeod is the director of Hartwick College Center for Craft Food and Beverage. The Hartwick College Center of Craft Food and Beverage is a resource for testing and education that supports small and mid-sized breweries, malt houses, farms, and other craft food and beverage producers, which is super important for what we're trying to do here in New York State. I did have an opportunity a while ago to see Aaron's lab and all of the wonderful things they're doing there, which are so important to the industry. So welcome, all three of you. Aaron, I think what I want to do is kick it off with you and talk a little bit about the malted barley and what's going on in the past and where we are.
Oh, thanks, Paul, and thanks for the invitation to talk with you today. And yeah, so I think what I want to start to do, since we're talking about barley varieties, is talk to the brewers a little bit about who are on today about the varieties that we're currently using, some of their strengths and weaknesses, and then how that relates to the quality of the malt that we make out of these. And so I have a few slides to share here. That is not the first slide. This is the first slide. So this, if we think about, making malt from barley that's grown in New York, although that was done a long time ago, pre-Prohibition era, there was a long period after Prohibition where we essentially weren't making any malt in New York State. And then about 10 years ago, when the first craft malt houses started to pop up, they needed some barley to grow. And we really don't have any homegrown barley varieties here in New York at that time. This was like 10 years ago. So the guys at Cornell basically jumped in to find us some barley varieties that we could grow by scouring the world, essentially. And through their nursery trials, both spring and we're able to identify both spring and winter varieties that, would work here for the farmers and for the malt houses. And so that's kind of brought us to where we are today. So today, these are the 8 varieties that are barley varieties that are pretty much grown. There's been, over the past 5 years, there's been sort of different ones coming and going. But right now, if you're a brewer in New York using malt that was made from barley grown in New York, it's probably one of these 8 varieties. So there's about 4 spring varieties and 4 winter varieties. Those are on the bottom. And you can see that they kind of come from all over. There's some Canadian stuff there in the spring side. Some stuff from the upper Midwest, North Dakota, and Minnesota. That's where they grow a lot of spring barley in North America. And then on the winter side, there's some American bred stuff. Endeavor is a USDA variety, and then some European imported genetics, Scala, TP, and Violetta. So It's about half and half. This was based on the number of samples that we received last year. So this would have been from the 2020 harvest, sorry, the 2019 harvest. And we had about half of the samples were spring varieties, New Deal, Conlan Synergy, Quest, and the other half of the samples that we received were winter varieties. So although a sample isn't sort of equal to acres, we could just say basically we have a good amount of both spring and winter. Now, these are very different in the way they malt and brew. And so we want to talk a little bit about those differences in terms of brewing quality. You can see here there's sort of a difference in where they're grown in the state. So when we looked at samples that we saw in the lab from commercial production, the winter types are really in that western part of the state growing area. And the spring types are being grown a little bit more concentrated in the Hudson Valley area, a little bit in the southern tier, and up in the north country. And we'll learn a lot more from Mark and Dan about sort of why that is, and what winter's good for farmers and spring is good for farmers. I really want to focus on the brewing side of thing. This is sort of an interesting family tree, you might say. And if you look at where our varieties are, the varieties that barley varieties that we're using are coming from, you can see that they're related to each other. So over here on the right, can I use this thing here? Yeah. So if you look over here on the right, we've got sort of a family of spring varieties, New Dale, Synergy, and Endeavor, that are all sort of descended from Hannah, this famous landrace barley variety from the modern day Czech Republic, used to be called Moravia. And so they have some similar properties in a way. So you'll see in a minute when we start talking about how these varieties behave in the maltose and brewery. Endeavor, Synergy, New Dale, they have some common sort of parentage, some common relationships. And then if we look at the other sort of set of varieties, our modern winter varieties, which are kind of over here, Wint Malt, Scala, Violetta, they are descended from variety called Plumage and Plumage Archer. These are UK land races up at the top here, and Archer Plumage was from Denmark and Archer was from Ireland, which is to say they kind of came out of that European heritage. And then through Pioneer, this variety Pioneer was the winter habit, and that was brought in the UK through plant breeding, and from that came this very famous Maris Otter variety. And our winter varieties that we're using are sort of descended broadly from Maris Otter in the parentage there. So we have some very great quality that's brought in from these, but very different sort of habits. When I'm thinking about grain quality, barley quality, there's two sort of primary drivers for malting and brewing performance. The first is protein content. Protein content is positively correlated with enzyme development. So, we know we need enzymes in the brewery to convert our mash. And so the higher the grain protein content, the higher the amount of diastatic enzymes we can produce in the malt, and negatively correlate with extract. So the higher the protein content in the barley, the less extract we actually get in the malt. So there's a balancing act there between extract and enzymes. And the other factor or characteristic that I really think about as being sort of dominating as far as the barley genetics is dormancy. This dormancy is really, it's part and parcel of the vigor of the grain. How once you bring this grain into the malt house, how much vigor does it germinate with? Well, that's related to how much dormancy it does or it doesn't have. The more dormancy that a variety has, it tends to be less vigorous in the malt house. So you can generally find sort of lower enzyme development or a little bit more difficult to modify. So when we start looking at each of the varieties, we can kind of characterize them in terms of the amount of protein and the degree of dormancy. So let's start with a spring variety like AAC Synergy, right? Synergy is essentially got no dormancy, right? It germinates with a lot of vigor, which makes it, very easy to work with in the malt house, but at high risk of sprout damage in the field. So we use a measurement called RVA in the lab to measure the degree of sprouting. So when you look at these charts, just think about the blue bar as the range of samples that we see in testing. So in each year, we receive samples in the lab that are from barley growers in New York. And then this is sort of the highest sample we saw, the lowest level. And then this blue bar in the middle, that's the most. You can think of that as sort of like most of the samples. So you can see synergy, in some very dry years, like 2016, we had a hot, dry year. That really pushes up the protein content. But typically the protein content's okay. It falls in the acceptable range we're looking for, that kind of 9.5 to 12.5. But over here on the right, we can see these yellow and red zones here for RVA. This means sprout damage. Synergy is sprout damage almost every year because of that lack of dormancy. So that's a big risk for our farmers in New York. And Mark and Dan are going to talk a lot about what they're going to do about that, what they're trying to do about that. So when it comes to the brewing qualities of synergy, we get the benefits of the lack of dormancy, which is to say we get, low levels of beta glucan, we get relatively high levels of enzymes, right? But that sprouting risk is very high. And once the grain is severely sprouted, it really, really decreases the value for the malting. So that's a risk. Newdale is essentially very similar, right? Newdale has, moderate protein levels, but again, very susceptible to sprout damage. And so for our growers who aren't able to, manage harvest timing and post-harvest drying, Synergy and Newdale are essentially not good choices on the spring side. Again, though, they tend to malt very easily and have a sort of a track record of good brewing performance. But the risk in terms of growing them in the field is pretty high. So then there's Conlan. So Conlan is a spring 2-row variety that is being grown. It's from North Dakota. It tends towards higher protein. So we always see its protein at the higher end of the range, but it's not as susceptible to sprouting. We see one year in 2017, we saw some sprouting, but actually the past couple of years, we're not seeing as much sprout damage with Conlan. So we know, yeah, okay, it has a little more dormancy. So this is positive. Although with the higher protein content comes, you'll see lower extract. So that's something you might have to give up. And it can be a little bit more difficult to modify. So beta glucans can be a little higher, or the malt house has to work a little harder to get them down, especially taking a little bit more time in the malt house, making that a longer process. One of the secrets of success with Conlan would be keeping the protein low in the grain through managing nitrogen really carefully and really trying to hold back on nitrogen applications so that we can get the protein of the grain low, and that will help boost the extract content. Quest is a 6-row variety, and any of you who were listening in yesterday in our conversation with Ted, Holly, and Dennis Nessel, Dennis from Hudson Valley Malt has really embraced Quest as a variety that's working for his growers. And one of the things that they're doing with this 6-row was, again, trying to keep the nitrogen very low. And so a lot of these Quests, these were grown in the Hudson Valley with very, very light nitrogen applications, and they're trying to keep the protein as low as they can. And you can see that it has really good sprout resistance. So that's a benefit for them. And when we bring it into the malt house, we see that it's got great enzyme levels. That's something that 6-row barley has to score. Maybe a little bit more difficult on the modification because of that dormancy, but if the protein's low, we still get good extract. So Dennis was really myth busting the idea that you can't, that 6-row barley is not for craft brewers. It's absolutely not true. One thing when you're doing your 6-row that you have to keep in mind, and I just want to sort of remind everyone, is about the kernel size. The kernel size is something that we can't get away from. So always be careful when you're thinking about looking at the kernel size, because here's an example of using the 6/64 sieve for plumpness. And this Scala and this sample of Quest, they actually both look very plump when they're measured. The kernel size is measured over a 6/64 inch sieve. But if we separate that out and also incorporate a 7/64, right, you can see that the distribution of kernels, the percentage of kernels that are larger than 7/64 on the Quest is actually much smaller. So that does show that if we're using 6-row barley, we have to pay close attention to our mill settings because the kernels actually are smaller. So yeah, just be careful when you're looking at plumpness as a measure of kernel size, because it can be a little bit deceiving. Plumpness isn't actually a very good measure of the average kernel size. It's really, you have to think about it as giving you information about the distribution of kernel sizes. Okay, when we move over to the winter varieties, this is Endeavor. So we've got, Endeavor's got a good track record of giving us, protein in the desirable range in the state, but this is a sprouter. We know this is true. In fact, in every year, we almost never, in any given year, we almost never see a sample that doesn't have some degree of sprout damage. I think it's important to know at this point that so it has no dormancy. So having dormancy or not is not a function of winter or spring. I think we sometimes think of our spring grains as not having dormancy and our winters as having dormancy, but that's not true. It's independent of that growth habit. So you can have any combination, and Endeavor is really the synergy of the winter varieties, right? It has a more North American parentage, and its malting performance is excellent as long as the grain is not sprouted, which can be hard to do, but it can be very risky for the grower. So our other winter variety options actually have some dormancy in them. Scala is sort of intermediate. It's gained a lot of popularity in the state. For the winter growers, it's come to be very reliable. Sometimes we see sprouts, sometimes we don't. We don't often see severe sprout damage. So we sometimes see, and very frequently, we don't, it's not sprouted at all. So we know from this then it has sort of some moderate sprout resistance or moderate amount of dormancy. And that leads us to generally, it also has pretty reliably low protein, like under 11%, a lot of the time. And that really does lead us to some very high extract potential. One of the things we see with Scala is low protein, big fat kernels, lots of extract. However, once that protein starts to go down, we also start to see the enzyme levels go down. So you get a much more European style malt profile than a typical North American commercial malt. So what can that mean? Well, potentially slightly longer conversion times, longer mash times, or maybe having to lower that mash strike-in temperature just a little bit to give the enzymes a little bit more time to work, lower temperature window. Violetta is probably got the most dormancy of any of the varieties we're growing right now in New York. So we almost never see a sprouted sample of Violetta. So it's got a lot of dormancy, moderate levels of protein, and it is reliable. Takes a little bit longer to modify in the malt house because of that dormancy. So longer than it's sort of the normal 7 days. But a thoughtful maltster that's working with Violetta can actually make some very good malt. You can see the specifications here. And then this is a little game that I like to play that's called Malternatives, New York Malternatives, right? So here on the left, you see the typical quality profile. This would be of like raw 2-row base malt. This is all Canadian and Western US barley. Moderate protein with good extract, well modified, and lots of enzyme activity. And so you say, well, can we make a malt here in New York that functions like raw 2-row? And the answer is absolutely we can, right? So here's an example using Newdale. Here's an example, which is a spring variety. Here's an example using Endeavor. And here's an example of Dennis's Quest base malt, pale malt. And you can see that they have, generally speaking, great extract. They're well modified, and it's certainly possible to get a highly enzymatic malt that's very similar in performance functionally to commercial 2-rows, and doing it all here in New York. And say, okay, well, maybe as a brewer, I prefer the sort of more UK style malts, right? These pale ale style malts. So something like Simpson's Golden Promise, right? This is popular with a lot of brewers. It's a very low protein. They have much lower levels of enzymes. So especially here with the diastatic power, you can see, can we make malts like that in New York? And I think the answer again is yes, right? So here's an example using Scala, which actually has a slightly higher protein, but still really excellent extract. That's something we know that Scala delivers consistently, and a very similar enzyme profile at that sort of 3 color, at that pale ale style. And we can also do it with Springs. So you can take Synergy, which has a lot of enzymes to begin with, but when you take the color up, it it balances out. And again, some great low protein and great extract there with synergy. So, these are very doable. And I like to show these examples to say that, that we can make excellent malts in New York, given the varieties that we've had to sort of find and scrape together. But that being said, our colleagues at Cornell, our screen sharing has stopped. Yeah, our colleagues at Cornell are going to take us further along this story and say, well, can we even do better than just scouring the world? Can we sort of can we come up with varieties that are actually purposefully, adapted and bred for both our growers and our New York malt houses and brewers? So that's kind of the story of where we've been and how we've got there.
Anybody have any questions for Aaron before we move on to where we're going and where we're heading? No? All right. Well, if you do, unmute yourself and stop. There's a lot of information here. So Mark and Dan, take it away. Where are we going from here?
All right, I think I will start. All right, how's that look, Paul? Okay, well, thanks to Paul and New York Brewers Association for having us speak here. For those who came in late, my name is Dan Sweeney. I'm a PhD student at Cornell in the section of plant breeding genetics. My advisor, Dr. Mark Sorrells, and I will be telling you about our barley breeding projects at Cornell. Let's see, there we go. Okay, so Aaron actually set this talk up fantastically in many ways. So I want to start with a little bit of history, since Aaron was talking about the history and kind of where we've been with malting barley in New York. But this is from a USDA bulletin in 1925 that shows historic, at that time, barley production. And you'll see right away that New York used to be a hotspot of barley production. There's a long history of malting, brewing, and growing barley in New York. Many of you probably know that Buffalo used to be a big center of brewing and malting, but as population generally shifted westward, along with some Canadian tariffs, and then Prohibition, that effectively killed barley production in New York up until 2012, 2013, when the New York Farm Brewery Bill came along. So many of you are probably in New York State right now and wanted to motivate our work a little bit with why we are breeding barley for New York. Aaron kind of set this up nicely, but in a nutshell, New York is not Idaho or Alberta. Most of the malt that you'd be purchasing from somebody like RAR is grown either in the upper Midwest, North Dakota or Minnesota, the Mountain West, Montana or Idaho, or the Canadian Prairie provinces. So those climates and those growing seasons are much different than they are in New York. So one thing to start with, in New York, we are producing winter and spring barley, as Aaron mentioned. And these are effectively two different crops. We plant winter barley in the fall, usually September to October here. And then spring barley, depending on where you are in the state, as soon as the ground thaws out and you can get your planter in the fields, we want to plant spring barley early. So down the Hudson Valley, that might be late March. The North Country, probably more like late April, maybe even early May. But we have different challenges and opportunities with both of those crops. The weather can produce some challenges for both of those crops. If there's too much rain or not enough rain at planting time or at harvest time, that can make life a little bit more difficult for the grower. We are working on both winter and spring barley at Cornell. My portion, I'll talk about our spring barley work, and then Mark will discuss the winters a little bit more. So one of the big differences in climate between New York and the more traditional barley growing areas of the United States and Canada is precipitation. And I mentioned precipitation at planting time, but also throughout the growing season and especially at harvest time. So a decent amount of the acreage out west is irrigated, and that allows really high yield potential, but it also helps manage disease pressure, keeps it low, because most diseases that infect barley like humid, wet weather. And then there's also a lower chance for pre-harvest sprouting, which Aaron also introduced. However, as the New Yorkers here know, New York is typically not too dry, except for the odd summer where we have a drought. But we frequently have wet growing seasons, and we often have rain around harvest time, whether that's late June for the winter varieties or early August for the spring varieties. And a couple of days of rain around harvest time can really increase our chances of pre-harvest sprouting, which can ruin a crop for the grower and the malter. We also have different malting quality preferences here. Aaron talked about this a little bit already, but generally, some craft brewers do have different interests in their malting quality profiles than what might be coming out of Idaho or Alberta for those rare type malts. So a lot of our breeding work is motivated by this need for strong pre-harvest sprouting resistance to protect that grower's crop and protect the maltster's ability to make malt, but also to have good malt quality, because craft beer quality is extremely important, and we want to have the best of both worlds here. However, this historically is difficult because pre-harvest sprouting and malting quality are often negatively correlated. So I'll talk a little bit about that going forward, but that's a big focus for us. So plant breeding is usually a long-term process. Plant breeders think in terms of decades instead of years, because it takes time to evaluate the new lines that we develop in multiple environments and multiple years to make sure that we have a variety that is stable and is going to perform well for the grower. It takes a lot of time and resources. But thanks to generous support from New York State Ag and Markets, the American Malting Barley Association, and the Brewers Association, as well as a couple of other grants at Cornell University, we have been able to fast track the breeding process for the spring barley considerably. We've cut that breeding cycle time by at least half, and maybe even a little bit more than that. And we've been able to do that through the use of winter nurseries to accelerate our line development, but also the use of genomics and advanced statistical models to predict how these barley varieties will do, whereas we didn't have those tools 5 or 10 years ago. So in brief, we started our first crosses in 2016, just a few months after I showed up on Cornell's campus. And then late in 2020, we released our first variety, which I'll introduce here in another slide or two. I do want to mention that the backbone of our breeding program actually has been AAC Synergy, which Aaron mentioned. Not only does AAC Synergy have great malt quality, but it has good yield for a spring barley in New York, and it has very good disease resistance as well, which I mentioned is important because of all the precipitation we have. However, we've also crossed a number of lines from Europe, North Dakota, and a few other sources, and Canada to Synergy to try and get a good mix of genetics to select from and try and work on that pre-harvest sprouting problem. So every year we test breeding lines in regional trials. That means we plant them in multiple locations across the state. So this is the first year that we had our advanced yield trials in direct competition with commercial checks, or with a lot of commercial lines. So our standard checks are AAC Synergy and Newdale, which Aaron mentioned already, but also a European spring two-row called KWS Tinka, which performs fairly well for us. It has more of a European style malting quality profile and yields fairly well. So we try to plant in early to mid-April. For those that remember this last summer, May and June were unusually dry. So some of our trials, my colleague and I had to do a lot of watering by hand with this tractor and this tank here. So that was a lot of fun. We were a little bit restricted on the locations we grow. We usually try to do 4 or 5, but COVID threw us all through a loop this summer, so we only had 3 locations, but it's still not so bad. And we've worked a lot with Aaron McLeod at Hartwick to run some malting quality for us. We also utilize the services of the USDA Cereal Crops Research Center in Madison, Wisconsin. And what's also exciting is that we had foundation seed production of our new variety Excelsior Gold, which I'll talk about in the next slide, and then another upcoming line called C198 that I'll introduce as well. So foundation seed is the step before commercial availability. It's basically taking our breeder seed from a small amount and growing it in a larger field so we can produce enough to market and sell. So some of you may have seen this announcement or even participated in our naming contest, but our new variety is called Excelsior Gold. A little background behind the name: Excelsior is the state motto of New York, so we wanted to tie it into New York State. And then gold is the color of barley at harvest time. It's the color of success, financial success, and it's the color of a lot of beer. So big thanks to whoever nominated that name in our naming contest. So we're excited about this because this is the first two-row spring malting barley developed exclusively for New York State growing conditions and for craft brewing in New York. I'll show this in more detail in the next few slides, but it has equal or better yield to current varieties. It flowers a little bit earlier, which we've seen to be a favorable trait in our trials. It has very good foliar disease resistance, which is a plus. It has strong pre-harvest sprouting resistance, and it has good malting quality compared to other accepted malting barley varieties. So this is a table comparing the agronomics of Excelsior Gold with a few of our other standard lines. There's a lot of data here, but the lines in the rows highlighted in green are the ones that you really want to look at. So we have AAC Synergy and Newdale, which are our two most popular spring lines compared to our new line Excelsior Gold. And if you want, you can peek down at C198 as well on the bottom, which is our upcoming line. But Excelsior Gold does have a yield advantage. It's a little bit taller, but we have not noticed any lodging problems over about 3 years of evaluation, so that's good. Spot blotch is our primary foliar disease resistant, or primary foliar disease, so it does well there. It definitely has lower pre-harvest sprouting than Synergy Newdale, which is a strong plus. And it also has a little bit lower fusarium head blight incidence, which is another really important disease trait. So the brewers, you might be a little bit more interested in the malting quality. We don't have a comparison for Newdale here. Synergy is our standard. So Excelsior Gold is, in what we've evaluated, we're within the target range for protein, within that target range for malt extract, pretty close to Synergy. It's been a little bit high on on beta-glucan for some of the trials, but we're excited about the other malting quality profiles, and we know that with a little bit of special handling in the malt house, that can be dealt with. It also has lower free amino nitrogen than Synergy, but still has pretty good enzymes. And again, if you want to peek down at C198, which I'll talk about next, C198 does have more of a European style malting profile, lower beta-glucan, good extract, definitely lower FAN, but still pretty strong enzymes. So this is coming up next. We had less seed available for this one, so it's a step behind CU31, but it has really strong yield potential. Its disease resistance is not quite as strong as Excelsior Gold, but it's on par with Synergy and Newdale, which is not bad. Has better pre-harvest sprouting resistance than Newdale and Synergy. Has a short seed dormancy period after harvest. Excelsior Gold does as well. And it has very good craft malting quality. So I think this is my last slide before I hand it off to Mark, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some other research that we're doing with spring malting barley. So Aaron nicely introduced the importance of balancing seed dormancy, pre-harvest sprouting resistance, and malting quality. So kind of this holy grail for malting barley breeding is combining pre-harvest sprouting resistance with good malting quality. So we've been working a lot with the scientists at the USDA, CCRU in Madison named Jason Walling to go forward with this research. But the graph on the right here shows 3 different varieties and how they might perform in terms of how long their dormancy lasts. So variety A, which is in pink here at the top, this has very, very low dormancy right from the get-go. So the x-axis is weeks after maturity. So you could think of this as weeks after harvest effectively. And it has a 95% germination rate right after harvest, and it peaks at 100% pretty quickly afterwards. This is very much a desired attribute for malting barley, and a lot of maltsters and brewers would love to have a barley like this. But oftentimes this is accompanied by strong pre-harvest sprouting susceptibility, like you'd see in Endeavor or Synergy or Newdale. They all have dormancy curves like this. This green line here, this has a little bit longer. It takes a little bit longer for its release dormancy, maybe up to a month or a month and a half before it's maltable. This could be acceptable. Something like Conlan or certainly Violetta is going to have a curve more like this. It takes a little bit of extra work from the malt house, but it's workable. And then something in blue here, this has dormancy that extends 3 months, maybe even longer. These types are really not acceptable for malting barley use. So we don't want to see dormancy like this. Although you have pre-harvest sprouting resistance in our blue variety C here, it's not going to be good in the malt house. What we're trying to do is seeing if we can find a pre-harvest sprouting resistant line or lines, or a genetic combination that enables a line to have pre-harvest sprouting resistance, but also have the dormancy curve like variety A in pink at the top. And through a variety of experiments that I've been working on with my colleagues, Travis Rooney and Carl Kunze at Cornell, we have learned a lot about the genetics behind these traits. We have a good idea of why Synergy, Newdale, and Endeavor sprout like they do, but then also how to maybe get this balancing of pre-harvest sprouting and malting quality resistance. So this will be not only useful for our program, but hopefully for barley breeding in general. So I'm going to hand it over to Mark now to talk a little bit about winter malting barley.
Thanks a lot, Dan. And thank you, Aaron, for setting this up for us. Really appreciate the great explanations that Dan and Aaron have provided on the requirements that we need to be able to successfully grow malting barley in New York. It really is true that malting barley is generally not that well adapted to humid, wet climates like the Northeast, and so that was the impetus that convinced us that we really needed to put together an aggressive breeding program to develop new varieties that have those special qualities, so that it can be successfully grown year in and year out in this region. So a year after we started the spring malting barley breeding program, we initiated a winter malting barley breeding program. And as Aaron pointed out, there's a lot of interest in growing winter malting barley. 3 or 4 decades ago, there was no winter malting barley variety grown anywhere in the world. This is really a very recent phenomenon. One exception might be the UK, because their winters are so mild that they can get away with winter types that don't have very much winter survival. But in the northeastern US and across the northern US, you really have to have very good winter survival to be able to grow winter malting barley variety. It's one of the main limitations to growing any kind of winter barley, feed or malting barley. So it's one of the traits that we put a lot of emphasis on in our winter malting barley breeding program. Like I say, we initiated this in 2017. We don't have the luxury of being able to grow winter malting barley in an off-season nursery, whereas we sent seed to New Zealand for the spring malting barley every winter, and then we got back beautiful seed from New Zealand at a ratio of 80 to 100 to 1 seed rate, the seed increase. And so that was a very powerful way to speed up the spring malting barley breeding. But we can't send it, our winter malting barley, to New Zealand because it won't vernalize and flower. So that means that we're constrained by the timeline on winter malting barley variety development. Well, this past year, I should say, we evaluated several thousand winter malting barley lines for diseases, particularly scald. Scald is more of a problem in winter malting barley than it is in spring barley. And again, we evaluated agronomic traits, seed dormancy, and pre-harvest sprouting. And we also did some malting quality analyses. But these were really, this is really very early in the testing program. And so we didn't have enough seed to do yield trials. However, last fall, we planted our first yield trials of a population of winter malting barley lines developed using the doubled haploid process. And what that means is that you, once you've made the cross, then you can initiate a procedure that induces haploidization of the individuals produced from that cross. So we can instantly produce inbred lines instead of having to go through 3 or 4 generations to get to homozygosity. So this really helps to speed up the breeding process. And we're doing that in combination with more conventional breeding methods. But like the spring barley breeding program, we're using the latest technology to try to speed this up as much as possible. Okay, next slide, Dan. So I'm just going to briefly go over some of the results of our regional testing program on the winter malting barley. We've been testing winter malting barley since about 2012 or 2013. Coincidentally, we decided to grow a winter malting barley breeding line trial the same year that the Farm Brewery Bill was passed. So in this table, I show you some of the agronomic traits of winter malting barley varieties. KWS Scala and SYTP and Endeavor have all been grown quite a bit in New York. Flavio a little bit, and Violetta, as Aaron pointed out, have also been grown in New York. Looking at the agronomic traits, we can see that the yields of the winter barleys tend to be a little better than the spring barley varieties. Pretty respectable yields of 60 to 80 bushels per acre. Good kernel weight on the winter barley because it has effectively a longer growing season, because it can start growing as soon as the weather warms up and becomes favorable in the spring. It's already established because of being planted in the fall. These varieties have acceptable winter survival. The only exception is Endeavor and maybe Violetta. They're both a little bit more tender. Winter kill a little bit more than some of the other varieties. In terms of scald resistance, Scala is susceptible, but SYTP, and I should say that seed is really not easily available for SYTP. It has to be brought in from other parts of the US if they grow it here. It's not available locally. But in terms of scald resistance, SYTP is very good. But also Violetta has good scald resistance. KWS Somerset and Donnell are not yet being sold in New York State. I do want to point out the variety that is highlighted in green. That's a variety that we've co-released with Oregon State University, and it's unusual in that it's a facultative type. That means it can be planted either in the fall or in the spring. And you can see that compared to the other winters, the yield is pretty good, very good kernel weight, good winter survival, and it's scald resistant. In terms of pre-harvest sprouting resistance, which we know is really important in this region, Scala, TP, Flavia, Lightning, and Violetta, as Aaron pointed out, they have good sprout resistance. But Endeavor is very susceptible, just like AAC Synergy. And they have some common genetic background, as I really enjoyed the pedigree slide that Aaron showed us. And then in terms of Fusarium head blight, which is also a major issue for our region, they're all pretty susceptible, with maybe the exception of Lightning and Calypso. They seem to show a little bit less in terms of symptoms than the other varieties. When we look at the deoxynivalenol, that data is a little less reliable because we don't really have enough data on DON content. But there really isn't very important. I don't think that the differences we're seeing are really very meaningful. So that sort of summarizes the agronomics on the winter types. I guess we'll look at the malting quality, Dan. This slide shows you some of the malting characteristics of these varieties. Protein generally looks pretty good. Lightning might be a little bit on the high side. And in terms of malt extract, we're looking for more than 80%, and I'll meet that criterion. For beta glucan, we would like to see that less than 100 parts per million, and except for Flavia, Lightning, and especially Violetta, the beta glucan looks quite high on those varieties. And I would just say that these varieties, these malting quality data are all from the CCRU, the USDA Cereal Crops Research Unit at Madison, Wisconsin. And I think that in some cases, Aaron would say that they need to be need to have a little bit more modification, but I'll leave that to Aaron to judge because he's the expert on the malting quality. And then in terms of FAN, we're looking for between 140 and 190. And they're all pretty much in that ballpark. The diastatic power, we're looking at 110 to 150. All looking pretty good on that trait. A little bit high on the LCS, Calypso, and Violetta. So that sort of summarizes the malting quality characteristics of these varieties that we've been testing. Next slide, Dan. So what's in the future for winter malting barley? I mentioned that we co-released that facultative malting barley variety called Lightning with Oregon State University. The American Malting Barley Association has approved this variety in pilot scale malt testing. So we know it has generally very good malt quality, but that seed is all from the Pacific Northwest. And so the conditions might be a little bit different for our region. We do have foundation seed available, but nobody picked it up last fall. So there will be no seed production unless somebody wants to produce produce this variety in the spring. I mentioned that it can be planted either in the fall or in the spring. The yield isn't quite as good when it's spring planted, but the seed is available in case somebody is interested in producing this variety in New York. So our winter malting barley double haploid lines have effectively reduced our timeline for a variety release to as early as possibly 2024 or 2025, depending on the weather, of course. We never know what the weather's gonna bring for us, but we're pretty optimistic that we'll be able to turn out a winter malting barley variety that's acceptable for this region in just a few years. It takes a little longer for winter variety development, but we are pushing it along as quickly as we can using the best technology. Next slide, Dan. I did want to end with a plug for an outreach event that we're planning in collaboration with people in the Pacific Northwest and the Midwest called Grains Week. This is going to be a free interactive online celebration of value-added small grains. And it's intended for the entire supply chain, all the way from farmers to consumers. The programming will be very diverse and cover all aspects. There'll be programming on brewing and distilling, baking and culinary uses, integrated systems, agronomic research, and grain systems from around the world. I don't have the link to the online registration, but I think if you go Google Grains Week, you'll be able to find it. This will be May 3rd to May 7th. So I encourage everybody to keep that in mind, put it on your calendar, and I think you'll find some of the sessions to be of particular use to you. Next slide, Dan. To wrap up, I just want to really extend our hearty thanks to the New York State Ag and Markets for their generous support over several years. I also want to thank the Brewers Association and American Malting Barley Association for their support, especially on the pre-harvest sprouting research that we're doing. We also received support from USDA NIFA program, that's the National Institute for Food and Agriculture, and Technology Center, the Center for Technology Licensing at Cornell, the Genesee Valley Regional Market Authority, and also Hatch funds from the USDA Federal Capacity Program. And of course, I have a great team at Cornell, David Bencher, Amy Fox, James Tanaka, and currently I have 5 graduate students that really pulled us through last summer when we couldn't hire summer help to plant and harvest our breeding program and our regional trials. I really appreciated the help that we got, the extra help that we got from our graduate students. So with that, I'll stop and I can entertain any questions.
Does anybody have any questions? I know there's a lot of information there. We've got just a few minutes left, so it'd be great to hear from you.
Thanks for putting that link up there on the chat.
Sure. So Mark, how many, so you've got a few varieties that you're working on in the future. I mean, what's the plan? I mean, the plan is just to keep doing this and doing this and doing this and improving. I mean, is it just come down to money and financing and like funding, all of that?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Paul. It does come down to funding. And like I said before, the Ag and Markets, New York Ag and Markets have been very generous and supported us very well over the past 6 or so years. And we're 100% dependent on that funding. You know, with the pandemic, that's thrown a wrench in the funding process. So we don't know if we are going to be able to continue with the variety development program. It really is totally dependent on Ag and Markets as to whether they can come through with support. The current year's funding is still in limbo.
Jason had a question, Sailor.
Hi, Jason.
Hey, how's it going, Mark and guys?
Good to see you.
Good to see you. So I just wanted to, until we get, I had a question about just overall the current seed varieties and availability and stuff. So, New York malt is still a little ways away. And, in the past, we've dealt with issues regarding kind of fluctuations in what is being planted due to the seed suppliers. Is this just a kind of foreseeable, something we have to deal with for the foreseeable future? Do we see any of the current varieties being, a more consistent thing that we can kind of plan on, or do the brewers have to kind of just, go with the flow as the different varieties come about, and the maltsters have to figure out how to work with them, and then in turn us having to figure how that changes? Thanks.
That's a very good question, Jason, and that's something is constantly on our mind. seed availability is a major issue for specialty small volume crops. And this has been a problem from day one. And Aaron appreciates the problem too. But what we're hoping is that the demand for Excelsior Gold will cause the seed companies to want to provide seed of that in large quantities. And it may displace some of the other varieties that are not quite so popular. But the seed companies really cannot afford to handle more than a couple of malting barley varieties. It's just too expensive for their operations. But if we can get a strong acceptance of Excelsior Gold and its successor CU198, we think that the companies will want to have a consistent supply of seed. But again, their volume has to be sufficient in order to support the overhead that's required to produce these varieties. And companies like Seedway will tell you that they're subsidizing the malting barley seed production. In fact, it's not making them money. So we have to make sure that we have enough demand for these varieties as they come out. It's just that they just cannot handle more than 2 varieties at any one time economically. Does that answer your question, Jason?
Yeah, I do have a quick follow-up though. In terms of the Excelsior Gold and the future varietals, what are the logistics on that? Does that then have to go to a seed company, or does that go directly to the farmers? Is it proprietary? Is it open source? What are some of the information on that?
Yeah, the timeline on Excelsior Gold is that the seed companies are going to be planting certified seed production that will then be available to farmers to buy in the stores in 2022. In terms of volume, I don't have an estimate on that right now, but we produced quite a bit of foundation seed last year. So I think there should be adequate quantities of Excelsior Gold for commercial production on a larger scale in 2022. In terms of the CU198, we think that that's going to be 1 to 2 years behind it, but we're pushing hard on that to get that into commercial production also. And so I think what we want to do is to encourage the seed companies to adopt these new varieties, and then hopefully there will be demand for seed of these varieties for the farmers and the malt houses and the brewers. Without the demand, they won't happen.
That's great. Any other questions? Wow. Well then, go ahead, Aaron. Yeah.
Sorry, Mark. I'll have a very technical question on the facultative. Would it be possible to grow the certified crop in the spring and have it harvested and ready to sell in time for the fall, or would that be too optimistic?
No, it could be done.
It could.
Actually.
Okay.
Oh yeah, that's a great question. It's one of the things I like about this lightning variety is it gives you tremendous flexibility in terms of seed inventory and production. So it would seem like that the company should pick this up if there's demand for it, and we know that it has good malt quality. So so we really feel like that the industry should pay attention to this new variety.
Yeah, there's always a chicken and egg, when it comes to these acceptance, right? We need to, at the same time as we're increasing the amount of seed availability, we have to get some of it over to the malt houses just so they can try, and if it's always been a challenge in every market, is to kind of try to do that at the same time. But if you can get any of little amounts, even if it was foundation, I know you want to get as much foundation as you can for increase, but a little bit over to, a malt house versus a market development trial, that could be a big help in the long run.
Well, we're looking for people to contact us that have interest in it.
I'll definitely remind people to reach out to you.
I will say that for any brewers out there who may know growers or have, who are interested in that sort of thing with their local malt house, lightning is definitely performs better winter planted. I would say if you or your grower are interested in growing as a spring, to maybe get a hold of us, because it's a little different than the other springs. It's a little bit faster to maturity. It definitely yields less in the spring. It is possible, but it's a little different than the normal spring. So I would,
I would
encourage reaching out to us if you think you might want to do that.
I agree with Dan. I'm thinking of spring production more for seed.
Seed. That's what I was
for
thinking.
sure.
rather
Yeah.
than commercial production.
Yeah. Do
Yeah.
the seed.
It's more for a seed production situation, but the yields aren't bad in the spring. They just aren't quite as much as the other spring types.
And I'll say for production, it is quicker to maturity than other spring types. So even another benefit there for production.
Right. Any other questions? Any last questions before we wrap it up? If not, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Aaron, for your expertise and hard work on all of this. I mean, really, none of it would be possible without it. And your communication with the brewers in the state and keeping us updated on everything. And thank you for your time today. It really is appreciated.
Thanks a lot, Paul.
You're
Really
welcome, Paul.
appreciate the invitation to talk today.
Thanks for having us, Paul.
Thanks, everybody. This recording will be up by the end of the day. SLA updates are next at 1 o'clock. Take care, everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.